I'm Holly,
And I'm Camille.
and we are doing preparation questions for part two, and we have 5, 6, and 10.
Okay, so for question 5, it was the Old Earth Ancient Life with the Comte de Buffon. And so we discussed about him. I've got that his career centered on an encyclopedia called the Histoire Naturelle, which basically he planned to contain everything that was known in his time about the natural world. But he was only able to publish 36 out of those 50 volumes before he died. He used the physics that Isaac Newton had discovered to propose the history of the Earth. He thought that a comet struck the sun and broke off some of that debris, which then became the planets of the solar system. This debris eventually cooled down and clouds formed, and this created the Earth in an estimated 70,000 years, according to him. He thought that life was able to happen spontaneously in the right conditions, just like many of the other Enlightenment thinkers at that time. He thought that all life on Earth was generated from unorganized matter, and that this life then migrated to the tropics as the climate cooled. From this, he proposed a type of proto-evolution by saying that as species moved to new habitats, the supply of organic particles that created those new individuals changed, and so the mold of those species would change as well.
Yeah, so I thought that it was really interesting how it said that he didn't specifically use the Bible as a direct guide. He, turned more towards the physics and wanting to prove it with something that was a little bit, I guess, something that they could prove or that they could see. And so I also thought that it was interesting how, although he started out as his theories being visionary, that they were later able to, I guess they were like, he was doomed, as it said, for him to have them be proven otherwise. And so we just talked a little bit about him and his life and his discoveries that he made.
All right. We had question 6, which was the colony of human populations with Thomas Malthus. I thought it was really interesting that he wasn't a biologist or an ecologist or anything like that. He was actually a political economist, and so that kind of lent an interesting perspective for it. He had his most famous work. It was called An Essay on the Principle of Population as it affects the future improvement of society. And basically this essay contained his thoughts and theories on whether or not a nation would ever be able to reach a point where laws weren't necessary and everyone lived in harmony and prosperity. He argued through that the growth of the human population was always going to outrun their ability to feed themselves. And he gave some numbers, but he said that this would always happen because human population would grow geometrically and the food supply could only increase arithmetically. So not as high of a amount. And so he basically, he treated groups, he treated human beings as groups of individuals and not just by focusing on every individual. And so he was able to do this using the same principles that ecologists use to study the animal and plant populations. Holly, what else you got for it?
So I just thought, kind of like you were saying, it's really interesting to take an economist's perspective of it opposed to a biologist, especially being a biology major. That you would think about kind of the supply and demand and having the offspring numbers really matter. And I thought it was interesting how he pointed off just kind of the various ways that species or populations could kind of die off, and then that way the earth wasn't, overflowing with beetles or earthworms or whatever else he had talked about. And so I think that it's always interesting to take in that perspective of somebody like not in the field, but how much it can really make a difference looking at like an economist's perspective. And then our last one was question 10, which was natural selection, Charles Darwin and Alfred Russel Wallace. And it talks about how a little bit of Charles Darwin's background. And in 1859, he published The Origin of Species, which had kind of changed the whole, I guess, that time period, that era of what they believed natural selection or evolution to be. And so he developed the theory of natural selection, of how to prove evolution to be true. And he used that with using various animals and how they adapted over time to create traits to survive when the environment changed, or to ensure that their offspring would live. And it talked about how Wallace, he at the same time was kind of doing a similar study, and how they ended up talking about how they kind of came together or compared notes, and they were almost exactly the same, and it was something that hadn't even been introduced yet. And so his theories were kind of the same with that.
Yeah, it was really neat reading about it. He had also published his book, Charles Darwin did, called On the Origin of Species in 1859. And so this was a huge, huge deal to the scientific world. And to basically everything else, to religion and all of that. It basically kind of turned the world on its head with having this. And he and Wallace had also taken inspiration from Thomas Malthus, the economist, and took some of his ideas and applied it, which was really neat. And it was also told us in the reading that within a few decades of Darwin's book being published, the majority of scientists accepted his theory of evolution and the descent of species from common ancestors as the truth. But they actually had a really hard time accepting the natural selection part of it, which was kind of interesting. But Darwin did have a lot of evidence with the evolution and natural selection. His most famous study was dealing with all the finches and their beaks on the Galapagos Islands in his travels. So this was really neat. Charles Darwin's kind of a really big thing. Anything else?
No, I think that's it.
All right. Well, that's our answers to the questions. I hope they helped everyone. And we'll